Hello, welcome everybody. Looks like we're still waiting for some folks to join, but as we get started, appreciate everyone for joining us for another webinar.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are, and thank you for joining us. As Ryan says, we'll just kick off in a moment. So I think actually while we're just getting ready to get going, it's probably worthwhile. What we're aiming to do today is cover off incident response for ransomware attack with a bit of a focus on Black Basta. So what we're going to do is look into how VRX can help with ransomware prevention, post-incident hardening. So first of all, we'll just do a quick introduction. So Ryan, if you want to introduce yourself, and then I'll follow up.
Yeah. As you mentioned, it's a pretty exciting topic today. One that a lot of people are talking about right now, and there's some things going on, out in the threat landscape. But yeah, to introduce myself first, Ryan, solution architect, team leader for Vicarius North America. I've been with the team here for going on almost 3 years. And prior to that, worked in incident response. So we're going to be talking about some of the things that I've seen out in the field, recovering from ransomware attacks and preventing them. So yeah, over to you, David.
Thank you. And like Ryan, I'm also solution architect team lead. I'm covering EMEA. So I've been with Vicarius for 18 months now. Prior to that, I've spent a long time working for doing cybersecurity, majority of that time for a value-added reseller in the UK. So lots of experience between the two of us in all sorts of different areas. So moving on, Ryan, if you want to pick up.
Yeah. So I think you kind of alluded to it a moment ago, but yeah, we're going to be talking about ransomware, some of the trends that we see. There's going to be an emphasis on Black Basta again, due to we'll be covering it later, but some of the chat logs that were recently leaked and how that kind of gives us some insight and a view into how a ransomware organization such as Black Basta operates and how we can use that information to defend and prevent some of these incidents from taking place in the first place. Just as a quick kind of housekeeping, if anybody does have any questions, we definitely love to see those. So throw those in the chat. We've got a couple people here. We're keeping an eye on them ourselves, and we've got Evan helping us out as well. So if we see some good ones, we'll throw them up on screen. We will have a dedicated kind of Q&A time allotted at the end. So if you rather save it till the end, you can do that as well. But yeah, definitely feel free. Cool. So yeah, just again, kind of a bit of an overview of how this will be broken down. By the way, apologies in advance if you've joined one of our webinars before. My audio quality is usually a little bit better. I'm traveling, so on a bit of a portable setup here. Apologies for that, and thanks for bearing with it. Hopefully it sounds okay. But yeah, again, what are we gonna be doing? Again, we're covering Black Basta, we're covering ransomware attacks. The breakdown of this session is going to be kind of just an overview of the threat landscape. What is this problem? Why should we care about it? Why now of all times? Ransomware is something we've been hearing about for years, but what's changed recently? How do those chat logs impact how defenders might want to approach this? And then again, kind of moving into exactly as I said, how do we address that challenge? Specifically, we're going to be looking within VRX, of course. Obviously, cybersecurity is a layered thing where there's not just one control, but we're going to be kind of covering some of the ways that we're helping our customers to defend against some of their known TTPs with Black Basta and some other ransomware gangs. And then we'll be going through a brief live demo just to kind of illustrate that point a little bit better, show you how exactly that looks in the platform, so that if you are a customer of ours, you can kind of follow along and run some of these things in your own environment and see what comes up. And as I mentioned, the Q&A.
So first up, we'll just take a slight step back, and what we're going to do is just do a little history lesson just around state of vulnerabilities, backgrounds around what we're seeing, and what some of the challenges that we're seeing on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis are. And the real challenge is it's simply down to the numbers of vulnerabilities. So every single organization out there, no matter what industry, they're overwhelmed by the number of threats and vulnerabilities that are being published. For example, here you can see we had more than 40,000 vulnerabilities published in 2024 alone, and that's 110 average vulnerabilities every day. There's absolutely no way of keeping on top of all of those and understanding what's going on. That's a 39% increase in the vulnerabilities year on year. So you can only imagine what the numbers are going to be looking like for 2025. They're continuing to increase. We're just seeing thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities every single month. So you can see here, this is a perfect example of the way the numbers are increasing. In terms of 2015, we're looking at round about 5,000 to 6,000 vulnerabilities over the entire year. And within 10 years to come to current day, we're now looking at probably that 5,000 to 6,000 vulnerabilities at least every 2 months. So the numbers are just continuing to increase, and they're only going to go one way. They're only ever going to continue increasing. So it's going to be a continued challenge for every single organization.
Yeah, I think that growth is really paints quite the picture. Pretty scary for people who are trying to defend against this. And as you mentioned, I think it's really almost impossible to say we're going to mitigate every single vulnerability we see. Maybe at that 2015 or 2016 numbers, sure, but nowadays it's just I don't think that's really a winning strategy. I think also this challenge is even worse than it appears here, if you can believe it. And the reason for that is, a lot of these types of charts are based on something like NVD, which, even they are running into budget and, other sort of resource issues with keeping up with this challenge. So, really, I think the actual issue is potentially quite a bit larger than it already is here, which is pretty alarming to think about. So, we're going to definitely come back to this later when we talk about mapping some of these vulnerabilities to ones that are known to be exploited and using some of that threat intelligence to really inform the ways that you remediate vulnerabilities.
And of course, this is only the published vulnerabilities. So there's all those other ones that we need to worry about as well. So exploiting vulnerabilities, really, what we're saying here is it's the exploitation of these vulnerabilities being one of the primary vectors of attack that the bad guys are using. And with those vulnerabilities, typically it's unpatched. So we've got a massive array of vulnerabilities that are out there. There are patches available, but they're just not being patched. We have the ransomware incidents that are occurring through that. And they do typically, again, they're beginning with the exploitation of those vulnerabilities, those unpatched vulnerabilities. And they often also bypass the traditional tools because they're not just relying on a single method of phishing or malware execution. So you've got lots of different approaches. And again, we'll talk through some of the approaches that the ransomware attacks take place, from the initial access through to some of the spreading techniques, through to how they then actually go after the data. And typically, we're looking at the zero-day vulnerabilities. So by this, we're talking about vulnerabilities that exist, have been recognized, but they may not yet have been published, and they're being used before patches are available. And the speed that the ransomware operators are weaponizing the CVEs and actually taking advantage, it's incredibly quick nowadays. And when you throw into the mix things like the AI tools that are available now, They can be used for good, they can be used for evil. So you can use those tools to weaponize the CVEs very, very quickly, very, very easily. And we're talking within less than 24 hours very often. So it's increasingly quick that this takes place. And we're also seeing that ransomware gangs are using cloud-based exploits, and they're looking for misconfigured SaaS platforms and APIs. So it's broader than applications and operating systems, but this is the area that we'll be focusing on.
Yeah, there's a couple points on this one I want to talk about briefly. So if anyone joined our continuous threat exposure management webinar a while back, one of the things we talked about, the importance of the continuous nature of a vulnerability management program. A lot of folks are, still using something that is doing periodic scans, which are, occurring monthly or quarterly or, whatever the frequency is. And just with, how quickly these are being weaponized, we're finding that that's just leaving a massive blind spot for organizations. I kind of relate it to, when you're in the grocery store and a new line opens up and everyone, there's that chaos of who's going to go over to the new line and be the first one. Ransomware gangs and threat actors love taking advantage of chaos. So, making sure that we're able to respond to that very quickly is, paramount.
Okay, so we then have the backup and recovery systems being targeted. So once they're in, we then have the challenge that they're looking to disable or encrypt, disabling and encrypting backups to prevent the recovery. So it's all very well. You may have those backups. Are those backups sound? Have you validated? Have you tested the disaster recovery? Have you tested the business continuity processes? These backups are absolutely critical. So if they're not valid, they're not worth it. So that can be a real challenge. And we're talking 75% of organizations that have been attacked have had their backups compromised. So personally, I check my backups on a regular basis. I don't rely on the fact that I'm doing the backups. I do rely on testing my own backups. Even though it's my own personal data, I'm backing up my data to multiple locations to ensure that I've got access, because we don't have things like physical photographs anymore. I don't want to be reliant on a single hard drive to make sure that my photographs are safe and secure. I back them up to an external hard drive, I back them up to the cloud, I back them up to multiple locations, and I check that I can access them as well. So the backups are absolutely critical.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think the probably single largest reason that anyone would pay a ransom following, a compromise is because of their backups being compromised as well. So, threat actors know this, and they're going to try to make sure that those backups are not something that can be used in the negotiations. They want to make sure you have the least amount of cards for those negotiations, and that you're most likely to be air quotes a paying customer. You're going to be paying the ransom. And again, the best way to do that in their point of view is by making sure that the backups are not in a usable state. So making sure that those are immutable, making sure that those are all of the data that you're expecting to be there is going to be there reliably, and can't be compromised. It's got redundancies. As I mentioned, it's immutable. Again, extremely important to this equation.
And the attackers, they're using multiple different mechanisms. So lots of these mechanisms, PowerShell, for example, it's a valid tool. So lots of these mechanisms and tools that the attackers are using are valid tools. So how do we actually manage and identify those? That's, again, another challenge to understand.
Yeah, that's a great point. Especially when you look at, so I think later we're going to talk about Cobalt Strike, and RMMs is another vector, that we see. So, these are, again, tools that you're using for a valid reason. So you can't just make the case of let's remove that because it is solving a valid purpose. But it gives a very high level of access, should it be compromised as well. So making sure that those are locked down appropriately is going to, be one of the really big prevention steps as well.
Yeah, sure. So on reviews of the industries, for example, that are typically seen at risk, they are very often large, vital organizations, so critical organizations, government, healthcare, energy, and they're reporting the highest rates of ransomware, again, via vulnerabilities. They're obviously high profile targets and very public targets. So it's very noticeable where they are hit. Private industry perhaps don't publicize so much, but inevitably on occasion it will be noticeable and have an impact, particularly where it's a public facing kind of service that they're providing, even though they're private businesses. But these are the highest risk industries. And it's predominantly because we're looking at legacy systems. So where you have legacy systems or slow moving processes, it's very difficult to prevent new vulnerabilities from being identified or to get patches on those systems because they may be systems that are no longer patched, or B, because the processes to actually get a patch onto those systems can be incredibly slow, or C, it might be some incredibly critical platform. So do we really want to be patching systems in healthcare or in the energy industry without knowing what's actually going to happen?
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
It's always the challenge.
Yeah.
And this is where the critical infrastructure attacks are also starting to come into play a lot more now. So this is where you're talking the oil, gas, utilities, and this is much more focused on the SCADA and industrial control system vulnerabilities, which have a whole world of different challenges around protecting and preventing attacks in that type of environment. So what we're seeing is with ransomware, we are seeing a rise and an increase of ransomware as a service. And this may be different sectors of the industry, if you like, the ransomware industry. You have access brokers who are selling the route into organizations. So they may have actually identified routes in and they will sell on that access. You then have your ransomware operators who are actually doing the ransomware activity. So we can see that the adverts for initial access brokers has been increasing massively over the last few years. And as I say, they're selling access to those systems to give access to other criminals who then take advantage, and then will start spreading laterally to encrypt, to perform the ransomware attacks. And again, there's increased collaboration as well, which collaboration between multiple different groups can only ever be a bad thing. Rather than them competing with one another, they are collaborating towards the same end, which is ultimately, it's always driven by one thing, money. And they're collaborating more and more to try and exploit these things further.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see how, and we're going to talk about this with the chat logs with Black Basta specifically in a little bit here, but I think it's really interesting to see just how much like a normal, legal business, these operations work. I mean, they often wind up having, some kind of internal dispute or some sort of chaos, or they get taken down and there's a fallout and another, gang gets spun out from it, as again, we're going to talk about here in a little bit. But aside from that, in its most basic form, if you look at how they approach things, it is very much like a standard business. Especially if we look at a sales organization where they're looking for this pipeline, that can be something that you can think of the access brokers for, and then you have the actual ransomware itself is trying to drive that outcome of getting that payment. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see that dichotomy, I guess you could say.
I guess it's as the industry is maturing. So if we go back a number of years, these were guys sitting in the basement by themselves, coding and doing it for fun, and then starting to get together in groups. And as the industry is maturing, it's becoming more and more like a true business.
Yeah, and again, it's alarming because you're looking at some of the things that they're doing and some of the automations that they've built out, and I'm sure you can relate to this as well. There's customers that we speak to that are in their defenses that they're doing, not just vulnerability management, but in other things, they're quite far behind the eight ball. So when you consider just how advanced some of these ransomware gangs are, it's really a losing battle. It's just a matter of time for some of these organizations, and it's just, I think, down to pure luck that they haven't been hit, if they haven't. So yeah, I think definitely we need to continue to stay on top of it, stay evolving, adopting new technologies. Again, you mentioned earlier some of those organizations that can be a little bit slower in moving and adopting new technologies and adopting new practices. And that's part of the reason why we see those in these really high numbers of percentages of being attacked versus other sectors.
Yeah, and part of it, of course, is also getting some of the basics and the fundamentals in place, rather than necessarily trying to get too far ahead and thinking about the advanced, latest, greatest, shiny technology. Let's get some of the basics right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you're up against a nation state actor, an ATP, right? If they want it bad enough, they'll find a way in. You're going to mess up sooner or later. The Leo here in LinkedIn is saying the rise of the machines. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think when you're up against something like that, hopefully if you are a target of them, you have a really significant amount of resources to dedicate to defending against that. But you need to make it just difficult enough for them to move on to the next target and say, okay, these guys are doing all the basics. There's no low-hanging fruit. These are very opportunistic people. They want to find the easiest way of getting their ransomware kit or whatever it is they're trying to get onto the machines, command and control, anything like that. And if they can't do that within a couple things, sure, they might evolve as time goes on. Again, we're going to talk about Black Basta and how they've used different access brokers and methods. The funny thing is they almost never use something novel. It's always something that's tried and true, phishing and scams over Teams and social engineering, pretending to be Microsoft support and things like that. So again, that's a really good point, that the basics will get you pretty far, actually.
Well, I guess it's one of those things you just need to be you need to be more secure than the next person.
Yeah, exactly.
So just a few numbers and graphs behind those, what we've been talking about. And again, this is just over the last few years. It's a bit of a comparison between the ransomware and the network breaches. So we're talking about access to the network and the ransomware. And what you can see is there is an approximate correlation between the two. Essentially, if any ransomware operators want to run their tool sets against a network and start encrypting and start doing that blackmail, they need the network access. What's interesting here, what struck me was the fact that this is by far the vast majority of the network access is actually much more on compromised credentials. So the network access, there is some vulnerability exploiting, but the vast majority is focused on compromised credentials. So that will be more from the phishing or those types of activities. So this is once I was looking at this is why it's the two the two kind of operators. You've got the guys who specialize in breaking and entering, and then you've got the guys who then specialize in looting. So once they're actually in, this is when you then see the vulnerabilities. So this is where you then see them taking the ransomware, the threat actors taking advantage of the vulnerabilities. So these are all vulnerabilities that have been used again, and as Ryan was saying a moment ago, again and again and again. And these are not new vulnerabilities. They aren't things that we don't know anything about. They are vulnerabilities that we should be able to fix and we should be able to remediate. So it's about getting those basics in place.
Yeah. It's funny too, going back to that CTEM webinar that I referred to earlier, and how I mentioned, we're seeing a rise in, and you mentioned as well, weaponization of vulnerabilities and exploits within a shorter time frame. But we are also at the same time seeing older vulnerabilities being used. So you really do need to look at both of those, and certainly a metric that I hear from a lot of our customers in vulnerability management is making sure that vulnerabilities that have been published longer than X amount of days ago have been mitigated. That might be a year, it might be 3 years, but making sure some of those old vulnerabilities have been mitigated. There was a string of I recall probably about a year or two ago, Win Verified Trust vulnerability, which is one from 2013. And one threat actor group found some success using it, and they're going to keep using it until that's exhausted, until it's burned, and they have to move on to looking up something new. So we do want to look at the latest and greatest, the newest vulnerabilities that are coming out, but we also need to kind of look back historically and make sure that we're taking care of some of those older ones as well.
Yeah, so I mean, even if we're looking at this, for example, you've got CVE 2019, and these are from 2017 to 2023. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that could be anywhere in the middle, I guess. But I do know we've still got SQL Slammer and Blaster floating around the internet.
Eternal Blue.
Probably before your time, I guess, Ryan.
Maybe, yeah. But no, it definitely makes sense. Eternal Blue, being a very large one. Proxy Shell, I remember I was working in incident response, that one up on the screen there a moment ago. I wouldn't be surprised if that's still being exploited on Exchange servers today. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and this slide basically bears out exactly what we're talking about. So if we look at some of these, and again, you've got 2017 to 2023. We've got CVEs here from 2012. We've got some old CVEs, but the key thing is, again, as Ryan has said earlier, that these are vulnerabilities in platforms that pretty much everybody uses. So you've got Office, SQL Server, you've got Windows printers, you've got a lot, Adobe Flash, although a Flash we would, hope not. But but the point is that these are products that everybody uses. And the other point to note is that actually it's being used again and again and again by different ransomware groups. You can see multiple different groups reusing these, or reusing the vulnerabilities, the attacks against those vulnerabilities. So the zero logon that we've got from 2020, that's one that was used by, we've got Black Basta listed, and one from 2021. So they're using old vulnerabilities to actually gain access or to spread.
We've been hacked.
Oh no!
Yeah. Hopefully you haven't seen this, and hopefully you never do. But yeah, this is what transitioning into. Let's kind of focus on Black Basta here. We've alluded to it, and we've kind of tied things that we've been speaking about in general with ransomware trends to Black Basta. But as we kind of move on here, we wanted to show what some people have had a pretty rough morning coming into the office and seeing this, and then having a pretty difficult week of trials and tribulations, or several weeks probably, more accurately, something like this. So yeah, let's talk about some of the specifics with Black Basta and like I said, the chat logs and some other things here.
So,
oh yeah,
no, after you.
Take care. Take it away.
Okay. So a little bit of background, just from a high level, for those of you that may not be familiar with Black Basta. So the ransomware as a service group. So as we said, this is becoming more and more of a business operation. And they basically came to prominence in around about April 22 was when they first started being observed and spotted. And around the world, they've breached more than 500 organizations, and that's across a wide range of industries as well. So that's covering lots of areas, including critical infrastructure. They also appear to very carefully target their victims to maximize the impact, and they're believed to be made up. I guess the maximizing impact also will be based around the financial side to maximize their returns on it as well. But they're thought to be made up of former members of other ransomware gangs, which again, this is part and parcel of the teams working together and the cooperative behavior, but that's down to similarities in the tactics, techniques, and the procedures that they're using. And the way they actually operate is with a targeted approach, we're talking about spear phishing. So they're targeting the users, or they're targeting insider information to get information, or as we talked about earlier, they're buying the network access. And I think this is a large proportion of the mechanisms that they're actually using to gain access was just buying it. If you can buy it, why go to the effort of actually trying to find your own way in?
Yeah.
Then, absolutely. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, again, they've kind of evolved over time. So using, whatever the latest trend of access is, and in some cases a combination of different ones, just to give themselves a really wide coverage and make sure that they have that ongoing, kind of pipeline. Funny to call it that, but that's really what it is at the end of the day. One thing that I saw, recently that they were doing, and this is kind of specific to vulnerabilities. We talked about spear phishing, and we talked about using Teams and impersonating Microsoft support and all of these other kind of things you would associate more with like user training. But more on the vulnerability side is they actually developed a tool. I believe it's called Brooded, if I'm not mistaken, and that was something that they developed to automate brute forcing these usually edge devices for VPN connections. And those were ones that were directly tied to specific CVEs, which we're going to be covering here in a little bit as well. But it just kind of shows that they don't just try one method, they'll try several. So you really do have to, again, make sure you're nailing those basics in multiple areas, not just one, and calling it finished. The other thing I think is interesting too is that they are, several things actually. One is that they're kind of they're thought to be based on former members of Conti and Revil or R-Evil. And again, we kind of see like there's this vacuum space when one gets taken down, or they, kind of cannibalize themselves, or there's some sort of internal chaos for one reason or another, which again, we're going to talk about with the chat logs here that I keep alluding to in the case of Black Basta. But there's kind of this space that, becomes filled and former members of one turn to another. So, a lot of the TTPs do remain largely the same, and they'll change with different trends, but at its core, they're quite similar, which as defenders does give us somewhat of an advantage, or at least something to, kind of have a basis of how we defend, because we know the trends, we know, what their behaviors are, generally speaking. So it does give us something to base that off of. The last thing I want to mention on this slide is that, with the types of organizations that they are going after, we're talking about, they're carefully targeting them. That's interesting as well. Obviously, going after things like healthcare, it's very visible. It's also probably one of the more shameful things that you can go after just due to its natures and obviously people's lives depending on it. So that's one that's always gets some raised eyebrows and a lot of visibility, as we said. But we have seen, not specifically with Black Basta, but several very large, attacks, and we're going to cover some of the news here on these guys specifically. But there's a couple of cases where Colonial Pipeline, JBS, the beef processor, several others, I'm sure, where it was almost too large, where they got a lot of kind of federal attention from various different countries, and it was a little bit more in the limelight that they wanted. So they kind of want to find that sweet spot if it's big enough, but it's not too big that it's getting this kind of federal governments involved in that kind of thing. So that's quite interesting as well.
So so one of the things that I did skip over there was actually around what they're doing once they're in, is that they're then looking to move laterally within the organization. So this is really where the vulnerabilities and the configuration problems come into play. So it's once they're in, that's where they're using and exploiting the vulnerabilities. They're using the native Windows tools. They're using various tools, that's essentially how the tactics and the techniques are identified through the use of these types of tools and how they're used. So then once they're in and they basically have a foothold, it's then boils down to starting to kick into the actual operation of the ransomware. So they use various mechanisms around controlling the platforms, which I'm sure Ryan can probably talk in a great more detail than I can about. But they're basically using that remote control, the command and control systems, to manage and to control the platform. Then they're looking to ensure that the data, that they have the only copy of that data. So this is where we're talking about deleting the backups, disabling security tools, deleting shadow copies, or encrypting the backups. Then we get the exfiltration of the data. So this is where we're pulling out all the data to the remote location. And then the last phase of the operation is when they perform the encryption, changing file extensions, and adding the ransom note, as we showed you a few slides ago. And they avoid the detection of the EDRs just by using advanced obfuscation techniques. But it's the encryption, when you have those encrypted files and you don't have the backups, this is really where the problems then start to occur.
Yeah. If we're talking about the official term for those kinds of things, it's usually how many levels of extortion are they trying to perform on the victim? Is it a single form in just the ransomware, or are we also talking about, I've seen cases where while the ongoing negotiations are taking place, generally the responders will be trying to take forensic collection so that they understand what was actually done, the initial vector, what data was exfilled, so that they can go to the negotiations with a little bit more sure footing. But look, what I'll see is that they'll be targeting these organizations with a DDoS attack while the negotiations are going on. So kind of kicking them while they're down. Beyond that, they'll also threaten to publish the data publicly, so that there's this kind of public mistrust and reputational damage. So that's another level of extortion. They'll make sure that competitors can get access to the data, and all of these different things. So they've kind of, again, want to make sure, and this goes back to the backups as well, making sure that those are deleted. So that loss of data being a very, very large part of this. The more of those things that they can do and kind of chain together, the more likely it is that the victim is going to have no choice but to pay the ransom, because it's simply too painful to not, and it's they find that it's cheaper to pay it to recover the data and stop this kind of bleeding, rather than trying to recover on their own. So moving on to the chat logs, we've kind of alluded to this quite a bit, and this is really the reason for this this webinar at this time. There's been several places that have done publications and really deep research on this, and I recommend checking them out. Usual places, Bleeping Computer has a brief write-up on this. Vulncheck, who are going to be covering some of the things that they posted here in a moment, did a really great research, and it's tied specifically to the vulnerabilities and vulnerability management. So that's a really, really relevant one that I would suggest checking out. Patrick over there did a fantastic job with that, and does a lot of great research and publications in general outside of this too. But yeah, basically recently we saw that there was a really large chat leak. This we believe to have occurred because Black Basta had targeted some Russian banks, and some people weren't too happy about that. Not uncommon. We've seen with some other malware that there is, within the code, it's avoiding systems which are using the Russian language, or their, the keyboard format is a Russian format, so that they're kind of bypassing, the source, if you will. So not too surprising that if they did go after it, whether intentional or accidentally, someone within the organization probably not too happy with that, and decided to kind of take revenge by sharing a lot of these chat logs. I think there was over 200,000 some odd lines of the chat that was leaked, which again is the reason that we're kind of covering this today, and the reason that it's trending right now. What's actually interesting is, with this whole thing, and you can imagine probably the internal chaos that's causing that, it drove someone to do this release, and I'm sure there's quite a lot of other things going on behind the scenes with them as well, and maybe we'll see a spin-off as we have in the past, or several. We haven't actually seen too much activity from them this year, so again, they're probably still in this phase of figuring out what's next. I'm sure whether again it's the exact same group or it's some sort of evolution of it, maybe it gets called something differently, but some of the same people will be involved, some of the same TTPs will be involved. So that all said, that's what we suspect is the reason. That's kind of the leading theory. A little bit of speculation there, but with enough evidence to say that's probably the leading theory. What we saw in the actual chat logs, in terms of the CVEs and in terms of the vulnerabilities, is that primarily they're using 62 specific vulnerabilities, which we're going to talk about in just a moment here, some of the specifics around that. But it does give us, out of those 40,000, 62 that we can focus on, which, is a pretty nice reduction. So, if you think you have to look at all 40,000, probably more than the 62, right? But, it gives us a little bit more of a focus. So that's always helpful. Of those 62, 44 of them happen to be on the CISA KEV, which is the known exploited vulnerabilities list that CISA publishes. So they're tracking to see what vulnerabilities are being exploited, and they publish this list. So there's about 20 or so, 18, I guess to be exact, which are ones that are not on the CISA KEV but are being used by Black Basta. In terms of the targets, we did kind of already talk about that, healthcare. We're going to share a couple snippets of news stories here in a moment, but there's specific healthcare organizations. I saw Rheinmetall, which is probably one of the largest German defense contractors, which is of course especially relevant given geopolitical situations right now, and several others, which again we're going to look at here in a moment. In terms of the targets, again, when you're looking at a ransomware, just as a sales organization would, just as a valid business would, you want to have the largest customer base possible. You don't want to develop a solution that is a very niche solution that only works on 1 out of 100 customers. You want something that you're going to be able to get a degree of proliferation. And that's exactly what they do. They're using things that are widely used across enterprise environments. So things like Citrix and things like, different VPN endpoints, Cisco, and you can see some of the other ones listed out here. Things like Teams, messaging systems. They were using Teams quite heavily for initial access for quite a while there, and probably still were recently. I think in the news and kind of the trends were pointing a little bit differently, where they were using that brooded tool for automating some of the VPN access. Obviously, automation wherever possible is going to allow you to scale that quite a bit. We talk about it more with defending, but obviously these guys are using it a little bit differently. So and I'm just looking at the time. I think that's probably for the chat logs all the time we have here, but definitely something that we could probably go on and on for quite a bit. One thing I did want to cover, I thought was quite interesting before we move to the next couple slides here. And yeah, here's that vuln check slide as well. So you can see these are the 62 specific CVEs, and you can see the top targeted countries, as well as the sectors. So, awesome job to the vuln check team for working on this. And again, they've got a really great post on it as well.
We've got CVEs there going back to 2017. Yeah.
So one thing I thought was really interesting, I think Bleeping Computer had this in their write-up, was that they were using Zoom Info. This was found in the chat logs, which Zoom Info is a tool that a lot of sales teams use to, when they're looking for leads, they're looking for customers who might be a good fit for their product, and who at that organization can they reach out to? What is their email? What is their title? So I thought it was quite funny that, again, we keep relating it back to how some of their practices and behaviors are almost akin to a real business, and they're using this tool, which is one that we've actually used in the past, which I thought was quite funny. So, they're really building that pipeline, and the main difference is their customers, they don't give them as much of a choice to to choose their solution or to pay as a valid business does. So, but yeah. And here we can see a breakdown of those CVEs. So these are again, this is from Vulncheck. These are the specific tools, or sorry, applications and operating systems that are being targeted with some of those CVEs we saw on the previous page. We can see Windows, a huge portion of that, no surprise there. Again, just due to its wide use, Exchange Server, Office, a lot of the usual suspects, Active Directory, Screen Connect, a lot of the MSPs will remember that vulnerability from, what was it, about a year or so ago. Like I said, just giving them a really wide coverage.
And then in the news, we can see we've got some really big organizations that have been impacted. And this is those that have made public statements about it, of course, or acknowledged publicly that was the cause of the problem. So in the UK, Capita, they're a huge outsourcing company, cost them more than £106 million, which is a huge amount of money. The other thing that's quite interesting is that there's been investigation done on blockchain and Bitcoin tracking to identify how much money they're actually making. Now, they've tracked at least 107 million Bitcoin, and that, if Capita, I suspect they didn't pay 106 million pounds in ransomware, but you can see the money is what's driving this. However, there's some good news and some bad news. Good news, prevention is possible. We can follow some simple cybersecurity advice. Keep up with the basics that we were talking about right at the beginning. The bad news, in many cases, once it's there, there's very little you can do unless you've got those backups. As Ryan was saying, you need to have those clean backups. But we can also, good news again, we can also help harden systems against these threats. So we've got a number of different approaches that we can help to prevent the spread of the attacks, to increase your levels of protection and to reduce your risks to your threat surface. So what we'll do is we'll give you a quick demo to show you very quickly some of these approaches that we can take. So just bear with me one moment quickly. So through the platform, through VRX, we can automate the patching. So we can automate all of the patching and the updates of the operating systems, of the applications, of the third-party applications. So we can help ensure that they are up to date and they are patching on a regular, ongoing basis to make sure that you're fixing those vulnerabilities, ideally on an automated basis, to reduce the risk. Where we don't have patches available, we then can also help mitigate in terms of some of the scripting approaches that we take. So we have a large library of scripts that we provide. We actually have lots of different categorization of these scripts. So we've got lots of different areas of focus around the configuration, but also around the security and around the hardening. So, for example, we have specifically around Black Basta, we have some that were focused, some scripts that are focused on the vulnerabilities that we were just talking about a few slides ago, that we were talking about the vulnerabilities for these specific exchange server attacks that we saw that they were taking advantage of. So we have detection scripts, we have remediation scripts, so we can identify where the vulnerability is, and we can also resolve the vulnerability. But beyond that, we also have, for example, we have other hardening scripts, other technologies, other approaches to help prevent the ransomware. So we can take some of the basics. We can look whether RDP is running. We can disable auto run. So these are the automatic approaches to reduce the risk. These are some of the best practices to try and secure the systems, enabling the potentially unwanted applications, creating the restore points. And then in terms of understanding more background about what may have happened, we can identify recently accessed files or browser history. And these scripts are very, very simple to run. We can simply select a script. So if we say check RDP, for example, we can say run now. And we can simply select an asset that we want to run on, or groups of assets. And you can run that and a one-off. That then will activate and run that. You then have visibility into understanding where in the environment do I have assets that are have RDP enabled, for example. Where do we have assets that that have RDP disabled, or what browser history do we need? So you can see here straight away, RDP enabled. So we can see very easily, very quickly, what's the status, and start to improve the position to limit and reduce the ability of the attackers to spread through the network and start to encrypt those files. So in terms of the scripting there, Ryan, did you want to add anything?
Would help if I come off mute there. Yeah. So no, just you know, again, I agree that we make it very easy. You can customize the scripts as well. So you know, we work with quite a wide customer base, different sectors, and they all have different needs, and you know, may use some of these things differently. So we provide these templates, which you know, I saw Leo was in the chat earlier. So Leo, if you're still here, yourself, Nahuel, you know, working on these X strategies, and some of the threat research that Nahuel is doing with these remediations, you know, kudos to you guys. Basically providing these templates, especially useful in cases where, you know, the customer doesn't have resources to be able to research, you know, things like this and create scripts in order to find if you're vulnerable to it and correct that. So beyond something like patching, which of course the vendor provides, and applying that, which we of course also help with, I think this is a great addition. And, the fact that we can now tailor this to specific threat actors and specific things like ransomware is really helpful for kind of narrowing that down. It kind of ties back to, again, with those 40,000 vulnerabilities, making that a much smaller focus on, in this case, the 60 something that Black Basta is using. And then, what are the ones that we can really easily protect against so that we can cover those bases effectively, easily, in a scalable way, in a programmatic way. So yeah, definitely something that, you should take advantage of.
And that reminds me, I said this earlier today, I was talking to a customer, and one of the things that they're doing is they're looking to develop a playbook of their own scripts that they can say, okay, if situation A happens, run this script against the Linux systems. If situation B happens, run that script. So they're using it for people who don't necessarily know the ins and outs of scripting, but they're handing over and enabling the wider team to be able to use these tools to harden the systems or retrieve information. And his background was very much in forensic analysis, so he did understand the implications around that side of things as well.
Yeah, I mean, environments are more dynamic than ever before, and there's just so many, vectors and so many applications, and things are more distributed. So that is, I think, kind of the next step in not only vulnerability management, but and maybe even you can say it's the current step, right? If you're at that level of, you're already performing basic patch management, you're already performing basic, EDR capabilities, whatever the most basic level of that control is, you want to get to the next maturity level of that control or of that sort of theme, be it a proactive control or reactive control. You want to make that repeatable. You want to make it reactive to different conditions that are occurring. So yeah, that's certainly something we see, and I think it's a really good kind of hallmark of the organization who's really maturing in their cybersecurity practices.
Okay. So I think we're probably almost done there.
Yeah, I think the demo, I think after that little bit, if we go back to the deck there, yeah, just a brief summary. So yeah, again, I know we're at like the last minute here. We'll save some more time for questions and hang out for a few more minutes. Appreciate for sticking with us. If you have to drop, that's fine too. But again, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, please drop that in there. In terms of just a summary, some of the things that we covered and some of the things that we need to focus on: rapid response, collaboration. We talked, it's pretty funny. We spent most of the time, we probably went over because there's just so much to talk about on the challenges and trends of ransomware and how they operate. And we spent, maybe, 5 minutes on remediation, which I think just points to how big the problem is and how interesting it is. And, I guess you could also take away from that remediation can be simple. If you boil it down, you can simplify it. So there is hope. A couple other things: early warnings, making sure that it's being done continuously, repeatable. I talked about several times. And vSociety, we didn't cover today. I briefly touched on some of the things Nahuel is doing with our threat research team. We've got some new and exciting things kind of brewing there, as always. And yeah, it's a great place to go and look at a little bit more of a deeper dive on some of the research that's occurring. You can see the scripts in the platform. So if you just want to go and run something, that's great. And if you want to read a little bit more, with your coffee, if you have a couple minutes, that's great too. vSociety is a great place to do that.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to getting the fundamentals, looking at those, patching and remediating the old vulnerabilities, is getting the basics right. That's what it comes down to. So I think It just remains for us to say thank you. And if anybody has any questions, please do raise those in the chat window, and we're more than happy to answer those.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Like I said, if there's any questions, we'll hang out for a couple minutes. Keep an eye on that, but definitely, connect with us afterwards, and if you'd like to kind of keep the conversation going. I see Evan's got the closing music.